I never expected to find anything of significance while clearing out my great-aunt Theodora's house. The elderly woman had lived alone for decades in the sprawling Victorian mansion, and after her passing at the age of 94, the task of sorting through her belongings fell to me. Most of her possessions were exactly what you'd expect: dusty furniture, outdated clothes, and box after box of faded photographs. But in the attic, buried beneath a stack of moldering blankets, I found something extraordinary. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. The cover was unmarked, save for a single name written in flowing script: Aldrid Blackwood, 1665. My hands trembled as I opened it. Aldrid Blackwood had been a distant ancestor, a physician who lived through the Great Plague of London. I'd heard stories about him growing up, but I never knew any personal accounts had survived. The pages were remarkably well preserved, though the ink had faded to a rusty brown in places. As I began to read, however, I realized with growing unease that this was no ordinary physician's diary. 12th of May, 1665. Today I witnessed something that defies all medical knowledge I possess. The plague has begun to spread through London's streets, as we all feared it would. But there is something different about this outbreak, something that fills me with a deep and gnawing dread. I was called to attend young Thomas Whitmore, son of the merchant on Bread Street. The boy presented with the typical symptoms: fever, chills, and a small swelling in his neck. But when I examined it more closely, I observed movement beneath the skin. Not the usual pulsing of infected tissue, but something deliberate, purposeful. When I lanced the swelling, what emerged was not merely pus and blood. I shall document this precisely, though my hand shakes to write it. The infected matter seemed to writhe of its own accord, and within it, I glimpsed what appeared to be minute, thread-like structures, twisting and coiling like tiny eels. Young Thomas expired within hours. His father begged me to examine the body, convinced some curse had befallen his son. I agreed, though I now wish I hadn't. The boy's lymph nodes, when extracted, contained more of these strange fibers. Under my microscope, they appeared almost crystalline, with complex branching patterns unlike anything I've encountered in my studies of the disease. I have preserved several samples. God forgive me, but I must understand what this is. 15th of May, 1665. 3 more cases today, all showing the same peculiar characteristics. The fibers appear in every sample I examine. They seem to grow more complex, more organized with each passing day. I've begun sketching their patterns, though I fear my drawings do not do justice to their bizarre intricacy. My colleague, Dr. Edmund Halsey, believes I'm allowing fear and exhaustion to cloud my judgment. He claims I'm seeing patterns where none exist, that these are merely the typical signs of bubonic plague. But he hasn't observed them under the microscope as I have. He hasn't seen them move. I must document something else, though I hesitate to commit it to paper. The infected seem to share a common behavior in their final hours. They speak of visions, Not the usual fevered hallucinations, but specific, consistent images. They described vast networks of tunnels, branching endlessly beneath the earth. They whisper about something moving through these passages, something ancient that has been waiting. I tell myself these are merely the ravings of dying minds, yet each patient describes the same scenes, down to the smallest detail. How can this be? 20th of May, 1665. I have made a terrible discovery. The samples I preserved, they've changed. The fibers have grown more numerous, forming intricate patterns that seem almost like writing in a language I cannot read. When I examine them, I feel a curious sensation, as if something is attempting to communicate through these bizarre structures. More disturbing still are the rats. London has always been plagued by them, but their behavior has become increasingly erratic. They gather in large groups, moving with an unnatural coordination. Yesterday, I observed a group of them in my laboratory, clustered around the cabinet where I keep my samples. They seemed to be listening for something. I've begun to experience strange dreams. I see the tunnels my patients described, endless passages that seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. Sometimes I hear whispers in languages that have never been spoken by human tongues. I tell myself this is merely the result of exhaustion and stress, but deep down, I know better. 25th of May, 1665. The infection rate is growing exponentially, but that is not what truly terrifies me. It's the patterns. They're everywhere now, in the spread of the disease through the city, in the way the rats move through the streets, in the very arrangement of the bodies we collect each morning. Everything follows the same branching structure I first observed in those tissue samples. I've started mapping these patterns, and what emerges is impossible to ignore. The disease isn't spreading randomly, it's creating something, building something, using us as its medium. Dr. Halsey visited again today. He seems troubled by my research, especially my maps and drawings. He suggested I take some time to rest, mentioned that many physicians have been driven to madness by the horrors we witness, but his eyes lingered too long on my samples, and I noticed his hands trembling as he spoke. After he left, I discovered several of my samples were missing. 1st of June, 1665. I can no longer sleep. The dreams have become too intense, too real. In them, I walk through those endless tunnels, following the branching patterns that have become so familiar. But now I understand what they are. A root system, spreading through the very foundations of our city. And at the center of it all, something waits. Something that has been growing, feeding, preparing. The pattern of the infection, when mapped across London, creates a perfect replica of the structures I've observed in my samples. We are not dealing with a mere disease. We are dealing with something that thinks, that plans, that has been waiting in the earth since long before humans walked upon it. I've discovered references in ancient texts to similar outbreaks throughout history. The Black Death wasn't the first manifestation of this entity. It has emerged again and again, each time growing more complex, more organized, learning from each attempt. Today I visited the Whitmores again. The entire family is now infected, but they're not dying. They're changing. The fibrous growths have spread throughout their bodies, visible beneath their skin like dark rivers. They speak in unison now, describing the same visions I see in my dreams. They told me it's almost ready, that soon it will be complete. I must do something, but who would believe me? How can I explain that what we call the plague is merely the visible portion of something far larger, far older, far more terrifying than we could ever imagine? 3rd of June, 1665. Dr. Halsey came to my house tonight, wild-eyed and rambling. He had taken some of my samples to study them himself, to prove me wrong. Instead, he found exactly what I had described. But he went further in his experiments than I had dared. He claims to have decoded the patterns, to have understood the messages they contain. What he told me cannot be true, must not be true, but it explains everything. The consistent visions, the coordinated behavior of the infected, the precise patterns of the disease's spread. We are not dealing with a plague at all. We are dealing with something that has been waiting beneath our feet for millennia, slowly building itself using human bodies as raw material. The fibers we've observed are not symptoms of the disease. They are its true form, a vast network that connects all the infected into a single, growing organism. And now, after centuries of preparation, it's finally ready to. The entry ends abruptly here, the pen having skittered across the page in a jagged line. 4th of June, 1665. I write this in haste. They are coming for me. I can hear them in the streets below, not just the rats now, but the infected themselves, moving with that same horrible coordination. Dr. Halsey is with them. I saw him through my window, his skin rippling with those familiar patterns. I've hidden my research as best as I can. This journal will go to my sister in Yorkshire, along with instructions that it should be preserved but never read. Some knowledge is too dangerous. The patterns are complete. The network is fully formed. Whatever has been growing beneath London is ready to emerge, to transform from an invisible web into something far more terrible. I understand now why the infected didn't die, why they changed instead. They were never meant to die. They were meant to become a part of it. And now, I hear them on the stairs. The rats came first, hundreds of them, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that should not exist in such creatures. Behind them, I hear the shuffling steps of the infected. To whoever finds this journal, burn it. Burn it and forget everything you've read. Some things should remain buried. Some knowledge should stay hidden. The patterns are everywhere now. Once you begin to see them, you can never stop. They're in the very fabric of our world, waiting to be activated. waiting to spread, waiting to... The writing ends here, replaced by a series of intricate, branching patterns drawn in what appears to be dried blood. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. I told myself it was just the ravings of a man driven mad by the horrors of the plague. But as I set it down, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on my wrist, where I had been resting it against the page, was a small, dark mark. When I looked closer, I could see thin, thread-like lines beginning to spread beneath my skin, forming familiar branching patterns. I spent the next 3 days convincing myself the mark on my wrist was nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps, or an allergic reaction to the old leather binding. But on the 4th morning, I could no longer deny what I was seeing. The pattern had spread halfway up my forearm. Dark lines branching beneath my skin like tiny roots. My medical training made it impossible to ignore the implications. The branching pattern followed my lymphatic system perfectly, tracing paths beneath my lymph nodes that I'd memorized in anatomy classes. But there was something else. Something that sent ice through my veins. The pattern wasn't just following my lymphatic system. It was extending it, creating new pathways that shouldn't exist. I returned to Theodora's house, desperate to find anything else that might explain what was happening to me. This time I searched the attic methodically, checking every box, every corner. Behind a false panel in the wall, I found a metal strongbox. Inside were more documents, letters, hospital records, and, most importantly, a series of correspondence between my great-aunt and someone named Professor Helena Blackwood, dated 1943. September 1943. Dear Theodora, I must thank you for sending me Aldrich's journal. As the last practicing physician in the Blackwood line, I've long suspected our family's connection to the Great Plague went deeper than historical record suggests. Your discovery confirms my worst fears. I've spent the last 20 years studying unusual disease patterns across Europe, focusing particularly on the incidents that mirror the 1665 outbreak. What I've found is deeply troubling. The branching patterns Aldrich documented have appeared repeatedly throughout history, always in isolated incidents that were quickly covered up or dismissed as medical curiosities. Enclosed are my notes from a case in Prague, 1928. A young girl presented with what appeared to be severe lymphatic inflammation. Within days, similar cases appeared throughout her neighborhood. The attending physician documented branching patterns identical to those in Aldrich's drawings. But here's what truly terrifies me. He also documented instances of simultaneous movement among the infected. 37 patients, spread across 3 hospitals, all turning their heads exactly at the same moment to look in the same direction, all blinking in perfect unison. The outbreak was contained only when the entire neighborhood was quarantined and dealt with. The official record lists it as a tragic fire. But that's not all. I found references to similar incidents dating back to ancient Rome. They called it morbus radicis, the root disease. The symptoms are always the same: the branching patterns, coordinated behavior, the whispered descriptions of vast underground networks. I believe what Aldrich encountered wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely one emergence of something that has been with us throughout human history, something that uses disease as a mechanism for... I hesitate to use the word, but I can think of no other that fits. Colonization. Your loving cousin, Helena. There were more letters, but what caught my eye was a folder of medical photographs, paper-clipped to the next page. They were from various time periods, starting with grainy images from the 1920s and progressing to clearer, more recent shots. Each showed the same thing: patients with distinctive branching patterns visible beneath their skin. The most recent photos were from a small outbreak in northern England in 1981. The patterns were identical to what was now spreading up my arm. But it was the last item in the box that truly shook me. A modern medical report, dated just 3 years ago from a laboratory in London. Confidential. Project Root analysis of tissue samples recovered from 1665 preservation reference, Blackwood collection. DNA sequencing has revealed anomalous structures within preserved lymphatic tissue. Branching filaments appear to be composed of previously unknown organic material with several impossible characteristics. 1. Samples remain metabolically active despite 350 plus years of preservation. 2. Filaments demonstrate ability to spontaneously organize into complex patterns. 3. When placed in proximity, separate samples display synchronous behavior. 4. Electron microscopy reveals structures resembling neural networks. 5. Samples emit low-frequency electromagnetic pulses at regular intervals. Note: after 72 hours of observation, samples showed signs of renewed growth. All testing suspended by order of department chair. Samples sealed in containment unit pending review. Update: containment unit compromised. Nature of compromise unknown. Samples missing. Investigation ongoing. Final note: project terminated. All records to be sealed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the last page. A handwritten note from my great aunt Theodora. To whoever finds this, I am the last of the Blackwood line to serve as guardian of these records. Our family has carried this burden since 1665, watching, waiting, documenting each recurrence. We thought we could contain it by keeping the knowledge limited to our bloodline. We were wrong. 3 years ago, something changed. The patterns began appearing again, but different this time. More advanced. The laboratory breach was no accident. It's growing, evolving. The network is rebuilding itself, using our modern understanding of genetics and neural networks to create something far more sophisticated than what Aldrid encountered. If you're reading this, you've likely already seen the signs. The marks will have started small, a branching pattern that follows your lymphatic system. Soon, you'll begin to notice the other changes. Moments of lost time, dreams of tunnels and roots, the sensation of being connected to something vast and patient and hungry. There's so much more you need to know about the ancient texts Helena found, about what really happened in Prague, about the true purpose of the patterns, but most importantly, about how they can be stopped. I've hidden that information separately. You'll find it when you're ready. when the patterns have spread enough for you to understand what you're truly dealing with. Look for the box marked with the root pattern. But be careful. Others will be looking for it too. Others who are already part of the network. Theodora. I set down the papers and rolled up my sleeve. The patterns now reached my shoulder, and as I watched, I could swear I saw them pulse, ever so slightly, in rhythm with my heartbeat. But something else had changed too. Where before the marks had been random, now they seemed to form distant shapes. Letters, almost. And I could read them. I knew I should have been terrified. Should have gone to a hospital, called someone, done something. But all I could think about was finding that other box. About learning the truth. About understanding what I was becoming. Because somewhere, deep in my mind, in a place I hadn't even known existed until the patterns reached it, I could feel them. All of them. Everyone who had ever been touched by the root patterns. Everyone who was a part of the network. And they could feel me, too. They were waiting for me to understand, to accept, to join. But first I needed to find that box. Finding the second box was both easier and more disturbing than I anticipated. My body simply knew where to look. As I moved through Theodora's house, the patterns under my skin would pulse stronger or weaker, like some grotesque game of hot and cold. They led me to the cellar, to a section of wall that looked identical to all the others, but I could feel it calling to me. Breaking through the plaster revealed a metal box, smaller than the first, marked with branching lines that perfectly matched the ones now covering most of my torso. Inside was a leather folder containing what appeared to be research notes, medical diagrams, and something that made my blood run cold. A series of brain tissue slides dated in 1928, labeled Prague specimens. But it was the modern-looking USB drive taped to the inside cover that caught my attention. Theodora had prepared for whoever would find this. My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop. The first file was a video recording. Theodora's face appeared on screen, looking gaunt and tired. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 2 weeks before her death.
If you're watching this, then the patterns have already started spreading across your skin. Don't bother trying to remove them. Surgery, burning, even amputation. The Blackwood medical records document every attempted treatment over centuries. The patterns simply regrow, following the same paths, always rebuilding the network. What I'm about to share with you is the culmination of our family's research, combined with modern medical analysis. Helena was close to understanding it, but she died before making the final connections. I've spent my life completing her work. The patterns aren't a disease. They're a communication system, a physical network connecting human hosts to something that's been growing beneath our feet for millennia. Each outbreak throughout history was an attempt to refine this network, to make it more sophisticated, more efficient. The Prague incident in 1928 was the first time it achieved simultaneous neural synchronization across multiple hosts. The tissue samples in this box are all that remain of that attempt. Under a microscope, you'll see that the branching patterns don't just follow the lymphatic system, they interface directly with neural tissue, creating new pathways between hosts. But here's what Helena didn't know. What we've only recently discovered through electron microscopy and DNA analysis. The patterns aren't adding something to our bodies. They're activating something that was already there, dormant in our genetic code. Every human carries these latent structures. The patterns just wake them up.
Theodora had a coughing fit. When she continued, there was an urgency in her voice that hadn't been there before.
You need to understand. This isn't an invasion. It's an activation. Every plague, every outbreak, every instance of the patterns appearing was just another attempt to switch us on. To activate what's been sleeping in our DNA since before we were human. The Blackwood family. We're more susceptible than most. Something in our genetic makeup makes us ideal hosts for the initial stages of activation. That's why Aldrid was among the first to document it. Why our family has been connected to every major outbreak. I'm running out of time. So I'll tell you what you need to know most urgently. The patterns you're seeing on your skin, they're not spreading randomly. They're forming specific sequences, like a code being written across your nervous system. Soon you'll start to understand this code. You'll begin to see how it connects to everything else, the tunnels beneath cities, the way diseases spread, even the growth patterns of plants. There are others like you out there. Once the patterns spread far enough, you'll be able to sense them. Some have been a part of the network for years, generations even. They've learned to hide the marks, to blend in. They're watching, waiting for the network to grow large enough for... No, you're not ready for that yet. First, you need to see the rest of the Prague documents. They show what happens in the latest stages of activation. But more importantly, they show what we've discovered about the source. About what's been waiting all this time. Growing beneath...
The video cut off abruptly. The next file was labeled Prague Stage 4.pdf. As I opened it, I noticed something odd. The patterns on my arm were moving, shifting to match the diagrams appearing on my screen. My body was learning, adapting, implementing the information in real time. The document began with a detailed medical report. Subject 23, Prague outbreak, Day 17, terminal stage observations. The branching patterns now cover 94% of the subject's neural tissue. Brain activity shows perfect synchronization with all other stage 4 subjects. Autonomous functions, heartbeat, breathing, occur in perfect unison across all connected hosts. New growth patterns observed in deeper brain structures. Subjects report shared consciousness experiences. Memory transfer between hosts confirmed through controlled testing. Most significant discovery: subjects no longer behave as individuals. They function as nodes in a larger neural network, each brain serving as a processing center for what appears to be a vastly larger consciousness. Critical observation. This network appears to extend beyond the human hosts. Soil samples from beneath Prague show identical branching patterns extending at least 300 meters below ground. These underground structures pulse in sync with the host's neural activity. Update. Subjects have begun modifications to their environment. Working in perfect coordination, they are constructing something in the hospital basement. The structure follows the same branching patterns observed in tissue samples. Purpose unknown. Final note. Military containment ordered after subjects began converting organic matter into new growth medium. Method of conversion unknown. Entire facility to be sealed and... The rest of the document was heavily redacted, but the images remained. They showed cross-sections of human brain tissue with the familiar branching patterns, but they were different from the ones on my skin. More complex, more organized, like circuit diagrams drawn in living tissue. The last page contained a single photo. A massive underground chamber beneath the Prague hospital. The walls were covered in branching patterns that glowed faintly in the dark. In the center was a partially constructed structure that resembled a human nervous system, scaled up to architectural size. But what made me slam the laptop shut was the realization that I understood exactly what I was looking at. Not just understood. I could feel my body wanting to recreate it. The patterns under my skin were already starting to shift, to organize themselves into similar structures. Something warm trickled down my face. When I wiped it away, my hand came back red, not blood. Something darker, with tiny branching fibers visible within it. I could feel them trying to grow, to spread, to connect. The laptop screen flickered back to life on its own. A new document was opening. As I watched, text began appearing, written in the same branching patterns that covered my skin.
You are ready to begin. Find the others. The network must grow. The structure must be completed.
Below my feet, I could feel vibrations in the earth. Regular, rhythmic, like a vast heartbeat. Or perhaps footsteps. I knew I should run, should burn the documents, destroy the evidence, try to stop the spread somehow. But instead, I found myself walking to the cellar door. Others were coming. I could feel them getting closer, their patterns pulsing in sync with mine. And deep beneath the earth, something ancient and patient stirred, ready to rise through the newly awakened network. The others arrived exactly as I knew they would, their footsteps echoing in perfect synchronization above me. I could feel their patterns resonating with mine, 5 distinct nodes in the growing network. As they descended the cellar stairs, I saw that they appeared completely normal, wearing ordinary clothes, looking like anyone you might pass on the street. Only I could see the faint lines beneath their skin, pulsing in rhythm with my own.
"Welcome, brother,"
said a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen.
"We've been waiting for another Blackwood to join us. Your family always produces the strongest connections."
I found myself answering in words that weren't entirely my own. The network requires a Blackwood to complete the next phase.
"Yes,"
she smiled.
"Just as it did in Prague, just as it will again."
But something wasn't right. As they moved closer, I noticed inconsistencies in their patterns. The branching structures beneath their skin weren't quite synchronized, showing subtle variations that shouldn't have been possible in a truly connected network. My medical training kicked in, and I began to analyze what I was seeing with clinical detachment. "You're not a part of the network," I said suddenly. "Not really. Your patterns. They're artificial." Dr. Chen's smile faltered.
"Clever. Just like Theodora. She figured it out too, you know? Why do you think she had to be eliminated?
The truth hit me like a physical blow.
You killed her. You're not connected to the network. You're trying to control it.
For decades, we've been trying to understand this phenomenon,
another member of the group explained.
We've attempted to artificially recreate the patterns, to tap into the network, but it never works properly without a true carrier. A Blackwood. Your family's genetic makeup is the key to interfacing with the deeper structure.
The Prague incident wasn't a natural emergence. It was an experiment. You try to force an activation. An experiment that you're going to help us complete. Your connection to the network is genuine. With you, we can finally establish control over the entire system.
They moved to grab me, but at that moment, something extraordinary happened. The patterns across my skin began to pulse with brilliant clarity. Information flooded my mind, not from them, but from something far older and vast. I finally understood what Aldrid had discovered, what Theodora had protected, what Helena had died trying to prevent. The network wasn't meant to be controlled. It was meant to protect us.
You don't understand what you're dealing with,
I said, backing away.
The patterns, the network, they're not a disease or a tool. They're an immune system, a defense mechanism encoded into our DNA millions of years ago, designed to activate when needed. Defense against what?
Dr. Chen demanded. Deep beneath our feet, something shifted. The vibrations I'd felt earlier grew stronger.
Against them,
I whispered. The cellar floor cracked. Through the fissures, I could see deeper channels lined with fossilized patterns, ancient neural pathways that had laid dormant for millennia. But between these patterns were other structures, alien geometries, invasive growth patterns that bore no relation to terrestrial biology.
There's another network,
I explained, the knowledge flowing through me from countless connected hosts across history.
One that's been trying to establish itself since before humans existed. Every few centuries it makes another attempt to take root, to spread through Earth's biosphere. The patterns we carry are our planet's natural defense, a way to detect and fight the invasion at a cellular level.
That's impossible,
one of them breathed.
The Black Death, the Prague incident, every major outbreak, they weren't random. They were responses to attempted incursions. The network activates when it detects the other trying to emerge. Every plague was actually an immune response.
The ground shook more violently. Through the widening cracks, we could see something moving in the depths, something with its own branching patterns. But wrong. Twisted and malformed, like a cancer of reality itself.
It's happening again,
I said.
That's why the network is waking up. That's why it needed a Blackwood. We're not carriers of a disease. We're antibodies.
Dr. Chen raised a gun.
This changes nothing. We'll find a way to control both networks. The power they represent.
She never finished the sentence. The patterns under my skin flared, and suddenly I was connected, not just to the network, but to every instance of its activation throughout history. I could feel Aldrid's presence, and Helena's, and Theodora's. All the Blackwoods who had served as nodes in this ancient defense system. Acting on instinct guided by centuries of accumulated knowledge, I pressed my hand against the earth. The patterns flowed from my skin into the ground, spreading outward in an exponentially growing web. Where they met the alien structures, they encapsulated them, just as human antibodies surround hostile bacteria. The others tried to run, but their artificial patterns betrayed them. The network recognized them as compromised cells and responded accordingly. I watched in horror as their pseudo-patterns dissolved, taking their cellular structure with them. They collapsed into organic slurry, their bodies converting themselves into raw material for the network's growth. Over the next few hours, I felt the network expand beneath, seeking out and neutralizing pockets of the alien pattern. Through my connection, I could sense similar responses activating worldwide as humanity's ancient defense system came fully online. 3 days later, the incursion was contained. The network began to go dormant again, but I knew it would never fully sleep. It needs active nodes to maintain its vigilance, watchers to monitor for signs of the next attempted invasion. That's why I'm writing this account. Not as a warning, but as a training manual for others who might find themselves becoming part of the network. If you notice branching patterns spreading across your skin, don't fight it. Don't try to control it. Understand that you're part of something ancient and necessary. An immune system that spans continents and centuries. The patterns aren't a disease. They're an activation. A call to arms in a war most humanity never notices. A war we've been fighting since before we were human. I still serve as an active node. The patterns are barely visible now. They only show themselves when needed. I monitor the network, watching for signs of new incursions. Sometimes I dream of the deep places, of alien geometries trying to take root in our reality. But I also feel the presence of other watchers, other nodes in humanity's immune system, standing ready to respond. We are the Earth's antibodies, and we are always watching. Final note found paperclipped to the account. To the next node who reads this, Dr. Chen's organization wasn't completely eliminated. They're still out there, still trying to artificially recreate the patterns. If you're reading this, they've probably already noticed you. Be careful. Watch for people with almost perfect patterns. And remember, the network isn't good or evil. It simply is. Like any immune system, it exists to maintain balance, to protect the whole at the expense of compromised parts. The patterns are spreading again. A new incursion is beginning. If you're reading this, you're probably already changing, becoming part of the defense. Welcome to the network, and good luck. We'll be watching for your signal.